Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone, back with the weekly solo pod. For this solo pod, I'm going to do a review of Week 5 NFL DFS. I'll probably be doing more specific slate reviews moving forward, just depending on if there's a high-level topic I want to talk about or not. I do still have on the back burner a podcast idea. Shout out EZ from the Hoops Discord for this idea on looking at ceiling and perceived ceiling on players, and if we're kind of the guys the market just thinks are like boring and don't have a ceiling, if that's true, if projections are capturing that correctly or not. But I want to take some time to get some pretty good data analysis on that before I do that. So this past week in NFL DFS, felt like I got kicked in the mouth here on this one. Really got crushed, and it was one of those slates where I talked about after week 2 in my podcast around tilt and how we handle things. Definitely needed the day off yesterday, Monday, to kind of get re-energized. Sometimes when you have those slates where you just get crushed, it feels like the time for the week was a whole waste. You feel a little bit defeated, but a day of rest and detaching, and now I'm back ready to go for week 6 and to learn from the week 5 stuff. And part of the reason why I do the recap is I do think it's a particularly good slate for me to recap, where I got some things right, I got some things wrong, and it's a little bit nuanced as each slate is. Initially, as this slate was going on around 3:30ish Eastern time on Sunday, I felt like I was in pretty good shape. I had a ton of JT, didn't have much Rico, but the way the slate was shaking out, didn't necessarily need him at that point. He had in the 20s, but not yet into the 30s. The Justin Fields chalk was really failing quite spectacularly. And I had a bunch of different lineups kind of set up to take advantage of that, where my floor was really high, probably going to get together some min cashes with some chances to win. And then Fields goes nuts, and in garbage time, in the worst possible way, especially with Garrett Wilson getting that last touchdown. And I went from being in a great position to really being behind the 8 ball everywhere, and ended up really getting crushed, just missing the cash line in a few spots that you definitely would have gotten there if the chalk hadn't hit in such a big way. And it's one of those slates where you're left feeling like you got very unlucky. And reviewing the slate after and using the solver post lock sims helped me to see, yes, I got unlucky in some spots, but I also didn't play super well. So first, I want to outline what my goals were going into this slate. I talked about this on ETM, again on Wake and Rake. I really wanted to show up with JT, Brees, and Achane as the 3 best RB plays. And kind of thought process there was value doesn't matter quite as much on this slate. That was somewhat true, where I said I was live at 330 even without the best running back performances, just because the raw total potentially mattered so much. I'm going to talk more about where I got this wrong and whatnot later, but just for now, the mindset was I wanted to show up with those 3, kind of let the field make mistakes, maybe try and play some of these values with shakier floors a bit more, and kind of take advantage there, go contrarian at wide receiver, get those contrarian stacks around the chalk. I was going to eat the chalk at defense, with the Saints just being so cheap, and like triple, quadruple checking that projection. Ended up running really hot there, as unlucky as I got on some other things. And then at tight end, it was like really eat the chalk with Tyler Warren or play Sam Laporta. Focused on those 2 tight ends. So those were my main goals. And sometimes when you're reviewing your play, the first thing you want to check is like, did I even play kind of what I intended or wanted to play? And the answer was yes. If you're watching this on the YouTube, you can see my teams up on the screen. I'll still talk through it so that if you only have the audio, it'll be a fine experience and you'll get it. But I had JT, Brees, and Achane. Each of those I had on 5 out of 6 of the main teams that I played. I played a team in the Thunderdome, in the 3K 300 person tournament, in the Game Changer, also about 300 people, and then 3 in the 555 milli, kind of longer shot. So 6 teams altogether, 5 of 6 with JT, 5 of 6 with Brees, 5 of 6 with Achane. I split up the fades, so 3 of the lineups had 1 fade of one of these guys, and 3 had all 3 of these guys together. So, check that box in terms of playing, those guys as much as I had kind of hoped. I played the contrarian stacks in the Thunderdome. My lineup's up here. It's pretty chalky overall, but the Herbert ownership was high at 27%, but not a lot of people played the double stack. So I got the Herbert double, played the Darnold double in the luxury box, played a Daniel Jones stack with Michael Pittman in addition to the JT Tyler Warren chalk in the game changer. And then in the Millie, my 3 stacks were another Darnold stack, a Jared Goff double, and a CJ Stroud double. Again, kind of getting a little bit off the board there with low owned stacks, but chalk around it. I did chicken out a little bit in terms of I used Laporta on 2 of 6 lineups, but they were both in the 5.55 milli. Was kind of afraid to use him in the 3 higher stakes teams that I played. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, but that would be the one thing I didn't really kind of play, even though I did say I wanted to play Warren or Laporta. Kind of imagine that initially being a little bit more spread out in terms of dollar exposure. And it ended up being quite lopsided towards the chalkier Warren in terms of dollar exposure. Now, what did I get right on this slate? I got right that the field stuff would steam in a really big way. It ended up winning tournaments, of course, but Fields comes in at 33% in the 3K, with Garrett Wilson at 28% in the game changer. Shout out Sam Brott, who came in second place there. And he did have the field stuff, but kind of played a high projected team that wasn't going to be duped and was rewarded there. The team that won also had Fields at 43% there, Garrett Wilson at 67%, Jake Ferguson at 34%, bringing back. So I wanted to leverage off that game by playing, Breece Hall, who ended up getting steamed. Talk more about that in a second, but did read the tea leaves right on the field stuff. And also, I think I read it right in terms of there was a path towards it failing, even though it didn't come through fruition. I got the ownership on the stacks I wanted. As I mentioned in the Dome, Herbert was played a decent bit, but Ladd was only 10%. It's only a 30-person tournament, so I was 1 of 3 teams with Ladd, 1 of 3 teams with Quinnen. I don't think any other team had the Quinnen and Ladd double, so I had the correlation aspect there where I wanted it. I got Darnold right where I wanted. One of the things I was most confident in was where Darnold will come in. He comes at 4% in the 3K, Cup at 2%. So I was really excited to get that. And then in the in the game changer, Danny Dimes got squeezed a little bit. He comes in at 7%. Again, a lot of that read was like, hey, Fields is really going to get steamed up here. It's got to come from the secondary chalk guys. Herbert got played a little bit more, had Dimes there. So I got the contrarian. You got the ownership I wanted on the stacks. JT was super important on the slate. His ownership came in fine, right around projected, and the ceiling he displayed was super important. Even with all the other value backs hitting, he was important on the slate. On Darnold and Laporta, those were 2 players I had a strong read on them, maybe outperforming their projection and staying low owned, and they both did. So I had really good read on that stuff. Jacoby Myers, I know we take a lot of flack for that projection. I ended up fading in 2 of the 3 high stakes teams, just knowing that people were going to play that projection, especially in the Thunderdome. I'm trying to find the ownership there. He came in at 63% in the Thunderdome. I got off of him there. On my 3K team, actually had a team pre-locked that simmed better with Jacoby, but I played Teteroy and McMillan at 10% instead of Jacoby there. So had a good feel on the read there. Of course, the projection ended up wrong. I did play Jacoby on 3 out of 6 teams overall. I played him on my high stakes team that had Danny Dimes, where it made sense in the game stack. And then where I thought my stacks were contrarian enough in the 5.55 milli, on a couple of those teams, I filled out an isolated wide receiver spot with Jacoby, just trying to get more projection into the lineup. What did I get wrong, though? So I came into the slate, as I said, wanting to play Breece, Achane, and JT a ton. And I got this wrong in 3 ways. Pretty impressive to get 3 things wrong on sort of one strategic element here. And the post-lock sims really helped me identify this. If you're a subscriber to Solver, I'll kind of bring up the post-lock sims here in a second on the screen. But that's just saying, based on the ETR simulated fantasy points and whatnot, how well your team over X amount of simulations would perform based on the actual field lineups themselves. So the first thing I got wrong was my idea with those three was kind of, hey, they're all chalky. They're the chalkiest three running backs, but I think one could get squeezed. I don't think they're going to get super steamed because I think the value running backs actually are going to get steamed a little bit more. Did not happen. Very wrong on that read. JT, as I mentioned, did kind of stay in line. In the game changer, I had him at 28%. In Thunderdome, I had him low 30s, which is pretty low there. But the other two, Brees and Achane, really got steamed. In the game changer, Brees comes in at 51%. Didn't play Achane there, which I'll talk about in a second. In the 3K, Brees was 51%. Achane was 55%. We had projected about mid-30s. So one I missed in a pretty big way, thinking, JT kind of got right, but collectively, the ownership was a lot higher on these three than I thought. Thought it might get a little higher, but not that much higher. The second thing is I kind of thought if I did run into that steam, that would be okay. Just the way the slate shook out, that I could maybe get away with that in terms of the value RBs maybe not mattering as much on the slate. And of course, they all hit in a pretty big way. Not only result-wise, but even process-wise, we see on the post-lock sims. All these teams that simmed really well pre-lock with these three running backs did not sim well post-lock, as you went from 35% each to 50+% each. Now the combinations you're dealing with too are owned, them played togethers played a lot higher than if they're 35%. So it ended up being a really meaningful difference in terms of leverage on the field and what you needed, where the projected points they offered did not offset the really high ownership. The thing I got kind of wrong result-wise was the value running backs all hitting. And when I say the value running backs, I'm mostly talking about Rachaad White, Rico Dowdle, and Michael Carter. Did not see that ceiling from Rico Dowdle whatsoever. Really shocked by that. None of them had the floor game I thought they could have. They all found the end zone. I will say at like 330 with Rico scoring 22 points, I was kind of even in an okay shape with him outscoring Brees and outscoring Achane. So I do see where there was that path that I was envisioning where just the raw points might matter so much at running back that if I hit on some cheaper low and wide receivers, that would offset maybe losing some per dollar value. But at the end of the day, look, Michael Carter, Rico Dowdle, and Rachaad White straight up outscored Jonathan Taylor, Brees Hall, and Devin Achane. So that was bad. I'm going to look at the luxury box here, the 3K that I was in, the post-lock sims, and you can see that my team here ended up with a plus 15% projected ROI on the actual field lineups. Probably simmed closer to 60 to 70% pre-lock, so lost quite a bit of value. Now, I did play Tataroya McMillan over Jacoby Myers. I'm fine with that aspect of it, where the sim assumptions aren't going to be perfect, and I think there was some archetype stuff that's hard to inject into the sims and our base projections on Tataroya that gave him a higher ceiling than we had. So I was going to sacrifice some EV there, wanted to get off Jacoby Myers. But you can see this is a lineup where I played Achane, Brees, and Jahmyr Gibbs. So of the three backs I really wanted to play, I end up not playing the one that the ownership stays flat and is probably the best play of the three. I replaced JT with Jahmyr Gibbs, who doesn't get squeezed despite this steam elsewhere. Gibbs came in at 21% in this contest. So now I've got the 50+% Achane and Brees. I don't even really have a super contrarian third running back, and I gave up a ton of projection on him versus JT without getting leverage. So this did not sim that great. Now, the other backs, Rico Dowdle came in at 28%, Rachaad White 31%, Michael Carter just 4%. So Rico and Rachaad came in a little higher, but I do think there's a little difference in missing, you go from 22% to around 30%. That's not quite as much as going from 35% to 50 to 55%. And there's also at a certain point, there's just so many combos of a team out there that even if percentage point wise, the increase was similar between Achane, Brees, and the value back. So um, that was definitely a mistake. It's also, I mentioned, not using Laporta enough. This is a team that could have used Laporta at single digit ownership instead of Warren at 39%. Thought Warren was a fantastic play. Fine having some exposure to him even at chalk. But again, I probably should have mixed in some Laporta here. And you can see the best simming teams in this contest. If we just get off my team, we look at the best simming teams overall. They generally have some combination of Jonathan Taylor with not Brees or not Achane, particularly not Achane. You see a lot of lineups with Javonte Williams, who came in minorly squeezed, but when other backs are steaming and you're staying at what you're projected or relatively squeezed a little bit, the gap's a little bit bigger. Saquon Barkley is in a lot of these teams up here. One of the value backs is in a lot of these teams. You have some teams with Rashad White, some teams with Rico Dowdle. So you look at that top 10 in post-lock sims, and none of them showed up with Achane, JT, and Brees together. In particular, the Brees plus Achane combo really did not look well post-lock. So this was a team you can see where even though I got the ownership I wanted on the Seattle stuff, didn't sim great because I didn't handle the running back position well. And kind of seeing this post-lock, I was definitely surprised to see this team sim so poorly, which kind of shows you there's a point at which even if you have a contrarian element in your lineup, if the other stuff around it gets too chalky and passes a line, you still may want to go even more contrarian, sacrifice some cash rate just because all the other lineups are so condensed, and it becomes easier to beat those lineups because you only need a few things to go right to have a team funnel all the way to the top. Now, I did have one team sim really well. My game changer team simmed well, where I read the Danny Dime squeeze a little bit, was able to get Michael Pittman in low double digits, got Jalen Waddle in there, who ended up getting low double digits. I thought he might not come in as high with the Jacoby Myers team, even though I played Jacoby on this team as well. But that was a little bit more correlated with having 3 Colts skill players plus the quarterback to bring him back. I thought that was a fine spot to eat the chalk. But the biggest reason this team sims well, and I'll go to it on the solver sims, it ended up being the top simming team in the entire contest post-lock. So probably the only lineup I got right. Saquon comes in at 5%. I play him over Achane. Achane gets steamed. Saquon gets squeezed. Shout out Sam Brott, who I had talked to prior to lock, and he thought Saquon was a guy that could get squeezed in this contest, and I agreed. And I played this version of the team over a team that simmed a little bit better pre-lock that had Achane. So this was one thing that I was able to get right a little bit. The spot I was maybe most disappointed was how poorly my teams in the 555 milli simmed post-lock. That's a contest really, with it being so top heavy, should be getting more off the board than I did, and actually had one team sim at 38% post-lock, one at 24%, one at minus 5%. As a contest too, where it's a little easier to sim higher post-lock because there's some like noise in who wins and whatnot. You can have some riskier teams with really high ROI, just unlikely to realize that. So pretty disappointing overall on this team. And Achane's on all these teams, the sims just do not like it at 43%. Even on a team where I played Javonte Williams over Brees, which was this Jared Goff double that had Goff, JT, Achane, Jacoby Myers, Devontae Smith, Jameson Williams, Sam Laporta, Javonte Williams, Saints. It didn't love it. Of course, Saints defense teams up there in ownership a little bit. And this team overall, I felt like there was enough leverage, but when Achane starts to get so high, it didn't totally love it. This was my, the team that simmed best for me post-lock because I did play at least Javonte Williams. The other two teams were the, hey, I'm going to show up with JT, Achane, Brees, and the contrarian stack, and it just wasn't enough. And if you look at the top simming running backs by average ROI in that contest, there weren't a ton of backs whose average ROI was positive on the week. JT was the main chalk back who simmed positive. Rico Brees and Rashad White were negative, but a little bit better than Achane. But the positive ones were Javonte Williams at 15%, Michael Carter mid-single digits, Ashton Genty and Saquon Barkley in the mid-single digits. And I did talk about this. I don't know if it was on last week's podcast or on the lineup build show, but a couple weeks in a row where you notice these medium-sized tournaments, a few thousand people in them, a little bit top. This one's a lot top heavy. Last week it was a Wildcat. These backs and players in general who project as like the 7th, 8th best values at a position, maybe projected for 10% ownership. If you find the ones that come in at 3 to 5 instead of 10%, that's having a really outsized impact on the sims post lock. And that's something that I'm going to try and prioritize reading correctly moving forward. And if we look at the top ROIs in there, there's a Darnold team that was second best in post-lock sims. It did play Achane with JT, but it didn't have Brees on it. It had Javonte Williams instead, and then played Trey Tucker instead of Jacoby Myers in a wide receiver spot. And it's a Darnold double. And the combination of having Javonte instead of Brees and then having Trey Tucker instead of Jacoby Myers was enough for this Darnold double to sim really well, even playing the chalk JT Achane. That's a team that I wish, I had played, kind of a better version of what I played. That was 143% post-lock sim ROI. Not that those are perfect. Those are never going to be perfect, especially if you disagree on the fantasy point projections we had on players. But also shout out to TJ, who had the top simming lineup. TJ, he's quite, very good player, quite off of the top of the post-lock sims. Actually played a Rattler double at really low ownership, and then was able to play Saquon, JT, Rashad White. Really interesting team. A smart way to play the JSN chalk in that team. Gets the low-owned Lions defense as well at 9%. But zooming out on this slate, I feel like there's a few kind of good macro takeaways that aren't like overly specific. First thing is, and I said this on Establish a Million for our ETR subscribers, I did look at this slate a little more earlier in the week than I normally do. And I feel like I got a little take locked on the Brees JT Achane trio as the best way to play the slate. There was some evidence late in the week that like, hey, maybe I'm wrong that the value running backs get steamed and it might be JT Brees Achane. So I didn't read that right. And maybe that's because there was a bias that I just wanted to play those players. And there's always kind of this give and take of being prepared for the slate, testing a lot of stuff early in the week so that you have a good sense of kind of the market and just the landscape of the week. But then also you really kind of want to be open Saturday night, Sunday morning to, okay, fantasy point projections have changed, ownership projections have changed. I want to make the best lineup as it is now. I definitely was overly dismissive too of how much the ROIs might change if these players got steamed, kind of thinking it was just going to be good no matter what. And as always, it's like tough between maximizing, your theoretical ROI versus diversifying in plays the play you really like. Like I played the guys I really liked. If we were to redo this slate, do I really want to show up to this slate with 0 Brees plus Achane together, which the post-lock sims are saying, hey, you should not have played these two backs together? Maybe the answer is yes, that I should have done that. But even knowing what I know now, would I have been able to, on all 3 high-stakes teams, not play any of them together? That's an interesting discussion. Easy to say when it fouls after the fact, but beforehand, a little bit tougher. Also, I'm asking, like, could I have known that it was going to be those two that got steamed and not JT? I think with JT being the most expensive of the 3 backs, maybe you could have seen it, but it was also such a loosely priced slate. I'm not entirely sure if I should have seen JT as the one to not get squeezed or to not get steamed, and Brees and Achane as the two that got really steamed. Other mistake I made, I had a little too much, and this extends from the running back, but applies to Tyler Warren a lot too. A little too much of the like, I'm afraid to get beat by player X mindset. 3 high stakes teams. One of those had to be Laporta. I had a really great read on it. I knew the ownership would be there, especially in high stakes, and I chickened out. So that's definitely a user error. The other thing is if you can't trust yourself to play optimally, whether it's across several teams or on one specific team, because you're afraid of getting beat somewhere on a chalky player or whatnot, you probably should drop down in stakes. That's one thing that I actually did right Sunday morning is I had 2 teams in the 3K. I took one of those teams down to the game changer, like last minute, because I just wasn't comfortable with what I wanted to play. I felt a little freer with that team in the game changer. Ended up being the Danny Dimes team that I played, the only team on the week that I played. That seemed incredibly post-lock, where I got Barkley in there, and I just played it in a much more intelligent way. And I felt like loosening up the stakes freed me to play that a little bit more correctly. This is less macro, but I have it in my notes. The field stuff definitely was unlucky. The garbage time doesn't hit. I had paths everywhere. Probably still an okay day despite not playing super well when it was all said and done. Sten ends up being, a complete disaster. Kind of reiterating something I already said, but I want to go through my final notes here. It's easy for us to underestimate the impact of some of these 5th, 6th best values coming in a few points below ownership. Hit on in the 555, Saquon, Genty. These are the players that simmed well post-lock. Michael Carter, who we knew would be low and stayed low, especially when other chalk steams higher. The relative disparity, I think, is huge too. So it's not just that Saquon comes in at 6% instead of 11. It's that Saquon comes in at 6% instead of 11. HN comes in at 50% instead of 35. And that's where you really start to see the more contrarian teams. And if you watch me on the lineup build show for established run subscribers this past Saturday night, one thing I hit on is if I have a lot of teams that sim well together, and even if you're not using sims, if you just have a few teams that look similarly strong to you, I generally would want to play the more contrarian one. It's just more likely, it's less likely that you run into the ownership being disastrous for you if you play the more contrarian side. Same thing with like the field stuff. You show up thinking it'll be 25% and it ends up 35 to 40. That's like generally not ideal. You show up with the 3rd, 4th best quarterback. There are times where the contrarian ownership comes in higher than we expect, and some of the chalk gets squeezed a little bit. But more times than not, it'll work the other way, especially in the contests I'm playing. They're a bit smaller, even smaller field than our overall small field. Ownerships are dictated towards our small field. I believe anything 1,000 people or less. I'm quite often, when I'm talking through this content, I think like the 300 person size tournaments is mostly what I'm thinking about. And then the final thing is if you're unsure at a position who's going to get squeezed or steamed, I think there's some validity in just diversifying a bit more and accepting, hey, you might have, a team or two that runs into the Breeze H-Chan JT at high ownership and won't sim well post-lock, but you might run into some Rashad White, Rico Dowdle teams that you were shaky on that look a lot better post-lock. And initially when I had as much as I was into JT Breeze H-Chan, I did, when I set my lineups at one point Saturday night, have kind of like, okay, a lot of exposure to these guys, but 1 out of 6 lineups with Rashad, 1 out of 6 with Rico, 1 out of 6 with Carter to diversify. I probably should have stuck with that, especially if some evidence kind of mounted that I might be wrong on my ownership read at the running back position. Wouldn't have played the slate perfectly if I did that, but would have played it a little bit better where, again, just kind of hoping that a couple of these teams are going to sim super well, and not trying to be perfect and read it exactly right. And I kind of tried to be perfect and read it exactly right, as if these 3 were clearly the best plays, when there were 6 to 7 very good running back plays. There was no obvious sign as to which of those plays would be, steamed the most and affect how things simmed post-lock. So that is the review for week 5. I know it's very specific to the teams I played and whatnot, but I'm hoping that it's helpful to you in terms of how to make your lineups moving forward, but also in terms of how to evaluate your lineups after a slate is played out. Because there's lots of times in our head, like me, where I thought I played great and then just got unlucky. And the reality of the situation was a little bit more nuanced than that. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. Best of luck in week 6.